Hello everyone, today we're going to talk about our respiratory system. Now our respiratory system helps us of course with cellular respiration, breathing. It also helps us with olfaction, which is our sense of smell, and speech. The air is going to travel from our nasal cavity into our pharynx, which is basically our throat, and then from there it's going to enter into our larynx, which is our voice box, and then from there into the trachea, which is our windpipe. The trachea is going to start to branch out, and those bronchus is singular, bronchi are plural, so the trachea is going to branch into several bronchi, and the air is going to start inflating our lungs. Now, the conducting zone, so we have two zones, conducting zone and a respiratory zone. The conducting zone are basically the parts that are going to help the air travel to reach the lungs. So such as your nasal cavity, the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, those are under what's known as the conducting zone. The respiratory zone are basically going to be the bronchi branches inside of your lungs, and then the cells inside of our lungs, the cluster of cells known as our alveoli. And this is where the gas exchange is going to take place. That's why we refer to it as the respiratory zone. Now, if we look at this image right here, we see of course, here is our nostrils for the air to enter through our nostrils. Right above it, there's this region known as the nasal vestibule, and it's a cavity superior to our nostrils. And inside of that cavity, we have hair, or known as vibraceae, and those hairs are going to help filter the particles from any air we go ahead and inhale. So it traps the particles. Either those particles we can blow our nose and get rid of them, or we can actually swallow them. Our nasal cavity, it's lined with a mucosa membrane, and it's a pseudo-stratified ciliated epithelial tissue. The cilia is going to be helpful, as the cilia is going to help filter the air that we are going to inhale, and the mucus within your nasal cavity is going to help trap any particles that might be in the air, and the cilia is also going to help move that mucus from your nasal cavity, and it's going to push it, so the cilia is going to move any of the particles, so it's going to sway back and forth, and it's going to send it down your throat. Now, within our nasal cavity, there are these parts right here known as the nasal conchae, and there are grooves in between those nasal conchae known as the nasal meatus. Why does it look like this inside of your nose? What's the point of having those nasal conchae right here? It actually helps enhance the air turbulence. So when the air enters into your nasal cavity, actually having those bumps within your nasal cavity is going to make the air spend a bit longer within your nasal cavity. As the air kind of goes and it has to pass through into those grooves right here, when it spends more time within your nasal cavity, it's going to give more time for the air to actually be filtered. Because as I said, in there we have the cilia and the mucus, so it gives it more time to get filtered, to get warmed up, because we have blood vessels, so the warm blood is actually going to warm up that air before we send it down to our lungs. The air is also going to be moistened and humidified before it travels down the pharynx and from there to the lungs. Let's see. Those right here are our sinuses. We actually, the sinuses are basically hollow cavities. And those hollow cavities, they're going to help lighten our skull. Mucus will actually be produced there. When we are sick and we get sinus pressure, our voice changes because the sinuses also help influence our voice quality. It acts as a resonating chamber. So after the air travels into our nasal cavity, from there it's going to pass into our pharynx. Our pharynx is basically our throat. It's a muscular tube made out of skeletal muscles, and it's divided into three regions. So we have the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. Naso because it's closer to the nasal cavity, oro because that part of the pharynx is closer to the oral cavity, the mouth, and then laryngeo because this part of the pharynx is close to our larynx, which is our voice box. The nasopharynx right here, it's lined with a pseudo-stratified epithelial tissue, and if you remember, pseudo means fake, so this epithelial tissue, it's really made up of just one layer. There's right here, here's the hard palate, and here is the soft palate, and this dangling part right there is the uvula. Now the uvula is actually going to prevent any food or liquid from entering into your nasopharynx. So when we start to eat or drink, the uvula is actually going to block the nasopharynx. And that's great because when you are swallowing, you don't want any food to accidentally enter into your nasal cavity. And you will notice that sometimes when you giggle or when you laugh or talk, and that uvula basically cannot stay closed when you do that. So if you are eating and at the same time you giggle, the uvula is going to open up and some of the food is actually going to enter into your nasal cavity. So that's the importance of the uvula. When we're eating, it basically blocks our nasopharynx so that no food or liquid would enter into our nasopharynx. And that's why your nasopharynx is not made up of a stratified tissue, because the only thing that's really supposed to pass down your nasopharynx is only air. Within our nasopharynx, there is actually the auditory tube or the pharyngeotympanic tube. So there's going to be an opening that's going to connect that part, the nasopharynx, with your middle ear. And that pharyngeotympanic tube or the auditory tube is going to actually help equalize the pressure in your middle ear. Down here is the second part of our pharynx, which is our oropharynx. And the oropharynx is going to be a passageway for both air and food and liquids. And the oropharynx is actually made up of a stratified epithelial tissue. The reason why it's made up of stratified, because now you can have food and liquid passing down the oropharynx, which can lead to more damage if the oropharynx was just made up of a simple epithelial tissue. The laryngopharynx is also made up of a stratified squamous epithelial tissue because air and food and water can pass down. The laryngopharynx is continuous with our esophagus, so our esophagus is going to be down here. Now, this is going to be our larynx or our voice box, and we can see that part of our voice box, we have this cartilage right here known as the epiglottis. And the epiglottis is going to be pretty important when you eat or drink. That epiglottis is going to flip and it's going to close up your larynx and your trachea so that no food or liquid would enter into our larynx. If it does, we would start suffocating, of course. So we are going to go ahead and zoom in on our larynx and see what it's made out of, but you see those like blue structures right here on the anterior view of the larynx, and those are basically a bunch of cartilages. hyaline cartilage to be exact. So we'll talk about, let's go ahead and zoom in on that larynx right there. So here is our larynx. Down here is our trachea. So our larynx is our voice box. It's, as I said, a passageway for air, only air, to pass from your pharynx into your trachea. You don't want any, one more time, any food or liquid to enter into your larynx. We would start suffocating. So the larynx is actually made up of cartilages, 9 cartilages to be exact. And those cartilages are hyaline cartilage, except the epiglottis, it's actually elastic cartilage. And epiglottis and elastic cartilage would give it more elasticity so that it can flip when you are eating, so that it can block the larynx and prevent any food from entering in there. Those cartilages are actually connected by a bunch of ligaments and muscles. And actually this cartilage right here, this is what's going to, we're going to refer to it as the Adam's apple, because when it merges, as you can see right here, it kind of creates that bump, which is the Adam's apple. Both females and males have it, by the way. It's just more prominent in males versus females. If we look at this image right here, this is showing you the vocal cords within your larynx, within your voice box. So we have 2 sets of vocal cords. These ones right here, those white ones, and they're white because they don't have any blood vessels. Those are our true vocal cords. So either you can refer to them as your vocal folds or your true vocal cords right there. And so during sound production, what happens is as we exhale the air, or as the air is getting expelled out of your lungs, those true vocal cords are going to start to flap against each other. And so when they start flapping against each other, the sound is going to start being produced. And therefore, they don't have any blood vessels, because you don't want them to have blood vessels. Otherwise, when they flap, blood is going to be scattered inside of your voice box. So they are avascular. Let's see, they would, those true vocal cords are the ones that are going to help us produce our sound. Now, there are those folds right here, right next to our vocal cords, and those are known as the vestibular folds, or the false vocal cords. These false vocal cords are not going to have any role in sound production. They're actually just going to help close up our larynx when we swallow. So when we swallow, you don't want your larynx to stay open. Otherwise, the food is going to enter into your larynx and from there into your trachea, and we're going to start suffocating. So these false vocal cords right here are going to help close up our larynx when we are swallowing food. The pitch of the sound is actually going to be determined by the length of your true vocal cords and the amount of tension. So when we produce the sound, those vocal cords are going to tense up. And so that's how we can have different pitches. How loud you sound, it depends on the force of the air that's going to be rushing out of your lungs. So the more air rushes out of your lungs with more force, the louder the sound would be.